Joining us in the studio now is Benjamin Anthony, CEO of the Miriam Institute, our political correspondent Batya Leventhal, our correspondent Robert Swift, who has been covering a lot of these events on the ground. Benjamin, the War Cabinet, as Emily mentioned, meeting this evening, reportedly in part to discuss a possible hostage deal. They're having to deal with scenes like that right outside, the psychological campaign, propaganda campaign being waged on Hamas with the release of this video, and also to weigh that against the security interests of Israel and how any kind of ceasefire in what length could impact the military operation. That is a very tough calculation to make.
Yeah, I think the psychological propaganda campaign against Israel is being launched at Israel's weakest link, which understandably is the family of the hostages. However, I believe it's a consequence of the great strength and the great success of the Israel Defense Forces in the military operation deep inside the Gaza Strip, which is only broadening. I do have to tell you, I and my organization have been working very closely with several families of hostages, particularly hostages who are what are termed men of age, the least likely to be released in any hostage negotiation. And not so breakable, not so weak, not so pliant are these hostage families. They have shown tremendous resolve. They remain very, very strongly committed, of course, to the release of their relatives, but also to supporting the activities of the Israel Defense Forces, giving the success that we're having inside the Gaza Strip. The other thing is we've seen a tremendous expression of solidarity with the IDF by Iris Chaim, who is the mother of one of the hostages, Yotam Chaim, who was killed by the Israel Defense Forces last Friday. We were working with Iris and her family. For her to send that message of love and support to the soldiers is really the example that I think everybody needs to follow.
Okay, especially we're going to be going to the UN in a bit. The U.S. is a factor here. They've made clear they want to see some kind of Palestinian self-rule there, and the likely address is the PA, which is basically Fatah. But for Israel, it's in a difficult bind, given what they're seeing, not just in the past, but even right now in the West Bank.
Yeah, 2 points about that. First of all, the Palestinian Authority is not fit to govern the Gaza Strip. The Palestinian Authority is yet to condemn the actions of Hamas on October the 7th, and the state of Israel should not be even considering handing over the keys to the Gaza Strip to the Palestinian Authority at this time. In addition to that, I want to alert everybody to the fact that we're watching the wrong people when it comes to the day after. The state of Israel came to this war massively divided within itself over the issue of judicial reform. That was an issue that may or may not have been critical, certainly in my judgment did not merit the tumult that it brought about here domestically. But now you've got real reason for very serious tumult, and the clock towards that kicking off and beginning is ticking away. You have more than 300,000 reservists who have been away from their families, their homes and their jobs for more than 2 months fighting. You have the families and the extended circles of more than 240 individuals who were taken hostage, and you have the families and the extended circles of more than 1,300 people who were murdered. All of that is going to come a cropper here domestically in Israel. It's time that the government of the State of Israel starts to think about that group, those people, and the day after when the guns fall silent, and how we're going to start repairing the cohesion of Israeli society. That should be our highest priority. The Gaza Strip, let's first win the war, and then we'll think about how we're going to govern.
Benjamin, I'm not so sure how the governments of Canada, Australia, New Zealand feel to be on the thank list of Hamas. But what you do see there is Hamas trying to basically split apart that Western coalition that to some degree has been supporting Israel's military campaign, but now seems to, on the issue of a ceasefire, beginning to splinter, and Hamas trying to drive that wedge in.
Yeah, 3 points on that. First of all, that Ghazi Hamad is the individual who appeared in front of the international media saying that as long as Hamas exists, it will seek to launch October 7th style attacks against Israelis again and again and again until they bring about the destruction of the state of Israel and the people therein. So this individual is not somebody, to your point, to whom anybody in the international community would want to be allied. The second thing is calling for a ceasefire with Hamas is tantamount to calling for the state of Israel to surrender. It's to surrender to the reality that Hamas will always oversee a terrorist enclave on our southern flank. That is an untenable situation. It cannot be allowed, and it would signal to our enemies on other borders just how unwilling the state of Israel is to move forward, maneuver, and to bring about a complete victory, a complete military victory, and then end the security threats that have dogged us since our withdrawal from the Gaza Strip in 2005. One final point, there was an earlier article on the show about Hezbollah and Lebanon. I've said it before, I'm saying it again. We should have hit that front. We should have hit it, in my opinion, before we even went into the Gaza Strip. We are where we are today, but by no means should we be dragged by the nose into a military reality that is of the choosing of Hezbollah rather than of our choosing. We can downgrade their capabilities from the air. It should be done. It must be done. And I do not believe that our residents should be expected to return north. I remind everyone, we have about 70,000 residents who are basically refugees within our own country, evacuated from the north, a similar number from the south. Those who will return to the south are expected to do so to a border that has a demilitarized entity on the other side of it. Those in the north should expect the very same standard extended to them, and that is going to require a very serious military operation against Hezbollah's capabilities inside southern Lebanon. It should come to pass very, very swiftly indeed.
Robert, you've been up on the north. You spent a lot of the past few months up there seeing the reality and the difficulty, as Benjamin pointing out, of those hostages. But it's a difficult balancing act for Israel, both weighing that kind of activity and how it might impact on the military efforts in Gaza, but also on the United States, which has parked its Sixth Fleet off the coast of Lebanon. It says to deter Hezbollah, but let's be honest, in part to perhaps also deter Israel from escalating that conflict into what could be more of it already is a regional conflict, but even beyond that.
The US has clearly been doing its best to prevent this conflict from spilling into a wider regional war, both with regards to the southern front and the Houthis, the naval conflict there, but also on the northern front. They've stated from the beginning of the conflict that they don't want to see Israel escalating things there. It does seem that increasingly Israel views that it doesn't have an option, that something needs to happen there for the reasons that Benjamin was just stating. But if Israel does go into Lebanon, A, it's then fighting on Lebanese territory inside Hezbollah's terrain, and B, that will be crossing a line that the US has clearly laid down on the ground, and then Israel has additional diplomatic concerns.
All right. Well, we did mention the United States, which has been supportive of Israel's aims in this war. Not always the tactics necessarily. Some of that may be tested in this wrangling that's going on in the United Nations over the wording of a new Security Council resolution. Benjamin, again, the issue of the aid continues to be humanitarian aid. Less the amount. Israel did open its Kerem Shalom crossing. We have to note that. It's actually said it can increase the aid, and is saying it's the UN that's holding it up. It's really the issue of inspecting the aid and making sure it gets in the right hand. Again, this week, several times, and we've shown all the footage here, we see those aid trucks being taken over by armed men, clearly operatives of either Hamas or one of the other terror groups there.
Yeah, just on the point of the UN Security Council, I think that they should be challenged before they start thinking about heady new resolutions that they're going to vote on today or tomorrow or whenever they get themselves together. Perhaps they'd like to actually implement and stand by resolutions that they passed in previous years. For example, Resolution 1701, that was supposed to ensure that what we're seeing on the northern border, this escalation of Hezbollah firing rockets towards the state of Israel, could not happen again, would be the beneficiary, we would be the beneficiary of a zone there, a buffer zone. It's not implemented that with any efficacy or efficiency or effectiveness. I don't expect them to implement anything in the future that they bring about and that they cast a vote on. And with regard to the aid into the Gaza Strip, I have to tell you, I understand well that Israel is playing the balancing game of enjoying and continuing to have the support of the United States of America. It's not perfect, it's not unbridled, but it's certainly strong, a lot stronger than many of the European countries. And that's contingent upon us funneling aid into the Gaza Strip. But since Hamas breached the terms of the previous release of hostages, I actually think that we should be reducing the amount of aid until such time as the release of hostages kicks up again.
All right, that Bacha, would be a difficult diplomatic idea to sell. But interesting, your report earlier did show Eli Cohen, the Israeli foreign minister, was in Cyprus yesterday. The reason is try to open a sea route, basically, from Cyprus to Gaza, to maybe the Gaza port, which Israel has now regained control of, what's left of it anyway, and basically just try to make an alternative route, either through the Rafah crossing and maybe relieving Israel of the responsibility and keeping it also out of not the UN's hands, giving it maybe the Cypriot security hands to check what's going in.
Absolutely. I mean, it's pretty obvious why Israel doesn't trust the United Nations, given their bias in the past, and also given what Benjamin pointed out, that there are resolutions that are in place that the United Nations Security Council does not abide by and does not enforce, let alone trying to get their act together to put through new resolutions that at the most basic point of this war do not mention Hamas. It is unbelievable that we are 76 days into this, the United Nations being involved as well, and not in a single amendment of or draft of this resolution is there a core of what exactly unfolded and why there's a need for a ceasefire, why there's a need for humanitarian aid, and why there's such a dire humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. And so I think Mike really hit the nail on the head. I don't think the United States or Israel, for that matter, is that concerned with the symbolism now of mentioning Hamas, but it does prove the point of Israel is not interested in allowing United Nations, at least any of their subsidiaries, either the World Health Food Program, none of them as well, to be included in such a deal where they would see humanitarian aid going into the Gaza Strip unchecked. And again, this is bringing to the fore what the United Nations has been pushing, right? The United Nations has really been gearing up a lot of the anti-Israel and a lot of the nations that tend to align more with the Palestinian narrative than with the Israeli, to basically point out the fact that Israel is the aggressor, there's a blockade on Gaza, and Israel needs to take responsibility. They forget that Israel is not the only country that has a border with the Gaza Strip. So does Egypt, and there's been barely any responsibility. The fact that they are going into the Sinai and retreating some medical assistance, where's the rest of the reports coming out from that? We reported on it within the first 2 weeks, and it almost fell silent. And so the reason that they're trying to open up this corridor through to Cyprus is Israel is playing into the hands of everybody that has been saying, we need to stop Israel, we need to allow aid going into the Gaza Strip. Well, exactly, then make it your problem. If there is such a dire humanitarian crisis there, and you are blaming Israel for a blockade, we will open up the blockade. Here's an entire front, being the Mediterranean Sea. You can open up a maritime crisis. It will go through Cyprus, a country in which Israel trusts, to allow aid to freely flow into the Gaza Strip. If I was a betting woman, Kalev, I would tell you that no matter what, a resolution like this is going to be very hard to put through, because it's not going to go through the United Nations. It's not going to be unchecked, which means that the so-called aid, which also includes ammunition, is likely not going to get through to the Gaza Strip.
But I do want to go back to that point we were discussing just before, Benjamin, about the investigation into the shooting of the 3 hostages who escaped accidentally by the IDF, as we said, and have we heard in the both parents of at least 2 of those who were killed expressing an understanding for what happened. It's the fog of war. The soldiers are under pressure. But there are procedures that soldiers, you were a combat soldier, and you learned, as I did, that you always fire warning shots unless there is an immediate threat to your life. And the IDF is going to have to come to some kind of reckoning here to answer some of the questions that are being raised by the public in this case.
Yeah, there are always different stages of engagement under the rules of engagement. Obviously, those rules of engagement become truncated in times of an active combat situation, which is very much the situation in which the soldiers find themselves inside the Gaza Strip. Incidentally, the soldiers who fired those shots are from among the very best of the Israel Defense Forces. These are soldiers who are training to be commanders, junior commanders. They don't necessarily have all of the experience that the more seasoned reservists will have, but they definitely have all of the military prowess to bring about successful operations. It's a tragedy. Everything that took place on that day is a tragedy. It's nothing short of that. It's well worth the investigation. That should be thorough and conclusive. But I do want to say that the soldiers of the Israel Defense Forces, while being briefed about the increased likelihood that they may encounter hostages as a consequence of the ongoing success of our military campaign, and I want you to know it is a highly really successful military campaign at this time. With all of that, they still have to bring about this balance of taking the fight to the enemy and, yes, eliminating the enemy. I think everybody understands they're in an impossible situation, and I think we who look on and commentate, at least I'll say it in my name, I'm going to assign a little bit of humility, not to step in there, not to pass judgment over them because I'm not in their shoes, but I've worn those shoes, I've taken that walk, and I know that everything that they undertake with the clearest moral values and with the clearest adherence to the task at hand, namely, first and foremost, winning this war. Again, one thing that does need to be reiterated, and you said you covered this yesterday, the note by Iris Chaim, that voice note saying that she loves those soldiers, that she supports those soldiers, and she invites those soldiers back to her home, that is the example that we need to apply. This overwhelming, overarching sense of unity and solidarity with our soldiers, who are our citizens, and our citizens, some of whom are our hostages as well. It's a very complicated triangle, but I believe ultimately we will find the resolution to what's going on there.
And just briefly, Robert, let's note the Daniel Hagari trying to avoid having the IDF, the army, dragged into the discussion about of a ceasefire, and whether make it clear that's really just for the political echelon now to decide whether that's going to be feasible in terms of a hostage deal.
Right, it's hardly surprising. The IDF itself is not likely to want to comment on something that is the purview of the political leadership. They're often keen to stress the fact that here in Israel that the military is subservient to the political leadership, unlike, say, Hamas, as the IDF puts it. And so, yeah, it's hardly surprising. And even if the IDF did have an opinion on it, they wouldn't tip their hand about it. So it's to be expected.
Right.